Hi, my name is Piper Harris, and welcome to the Untangled Mind podcast, where I help you untangle your mind to untangle your life's challenges. I'm a data driven mental health therapist in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, and an expert in third wave CBT for individuals dealing with trauma and anxiety. On today's episode, I'm unpacking the neuroscience of empathy, why so many professionals confuse empathic distress with compassion, and how our culture has turned burnout into a badge of honor. I'll share some real life examples, including what happens when a clinician becomes so overwhelmed by empathy that they literally disassociate in the middle of session. This is episode 2 of the Empathy series, When Empathy Hurts the Brain. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me again today. So today we are hitting part 2 of this empathy series. Again, like I said in the first part, and if you haven't listened to that, go ahead and listen to that one. That's episode 63. But we're jumping into this empathy series just because I'm seeing so much chatter about it, both negative and positive. And I thought, well, let's do a series on this and really talk about it. So today we're really talking about how empathy really impacts our brain and our body, and that empathy is not just an emotional posture, it's actually a physiological event as well. And if you stay stuck in empathy, the cost is not just psychological, it's actually physical as well. So let's talk about the neuroscience of empathy. When researchers put people in the fMRI machines, this shows the brain, and they show them images of other people in pain, what we see on this imaging is the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex light up. So these are the same regions of the brain that activate when you are actually in pain, which is fascinating. So, in other words, when we empathize with someone, our brain treats someone else's suffering as though it were our own. That's why empathy can be really dangerous if it's unchanneled. So, although that sounds super noble, right, that we're going to feel somebody else's pain, there is a catch. So, the constant stimulation of pain, it's not neutral. You can't feel someone's pain and see it light up in the brain regions that show it as if you're going through it and it not create an issue. It creates something that we call empathic distress. So it really primes our nervous system for suffering. And here's the key: the more that you stay in this area, the more you live there, the more stress you feel physiologically, and it's activated. Like the whole physiology is activated if you just sit there in empathy. So, what we have to understand is that empathy pulls on the same circuits that keep you, say, in hypervigilance, exhaustion, tension, all of that. So, when our brain perceives pain, like when we empathize with somebody else's pain, the amygdala activates. So the amygdala, that's the brain's kind of alarm bell. That's the most primitive part of our brain. Our brain actually forms bottom up. And so the amygdala is very important. It keeps us safe, but it's really not intelligent. It just is constantly scanning the environment for danger. So what happens when we perceive pain through this empathized pain, the amygdala turns on and then it signals to the hypothalamus to activate the HPA axis. So if you know a lot about the HPA axis, it's the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenals. So this whole system preps our body for stress, to regulate stress, to manage stress, to get through stress. So what happens is our cortisol is released, and that really prepares our body for threat. So this is the fight or flight system that we hear about, the sympathetic system of our autonomic system. So if you are to stay in that empathic distress, basically you're essentially living in this very low grade threat state. But low grade, it doesn't always just stay there. So what happens is that cortisol, it remains elevated and the nervous system never downshifts, right? And so over time, this really does lead to massive burnout. You'll see this in like immune suppression, poor sleep, maybe anxiety or depression. You might see some GI issues. So again, this goes back to, if empathy is not channeled, it's just simply going to keep firing and exhausting you. It's biologically unsustainable. It really is. So we have to understand empathy is a wonderful, beautiful thing, but the whole premise of this series is that we can't sit in empathy. Sitting in empathy is really not a good place to stay. So here's also where some of the science gets really, really fascinating. So we're talking about, we already see on brain imaging with individuals that are shown images of somebody that's under distress that the brain regions light up as if you're having the pain, right? Well, there was this other research team led by Tanya Singer, and she compared empathy with compassion. So, what happened was when people experienced that empathic distress, of course, those pain centers lit up, right? The anterior insula, anterior cingulate cortex. But she taught people how to shift into compassion. And that's a totally different system that lit up on that fMRI, which is fabulous. So, what lit up on there was the ventral striatum and the medial orbitofrontal cortex. Say that 3 times fast. All that to mean these regions actually are tied to reward, motivation, and positive affect. So, when we teach people to not sit in that empathic distress, empathy, if unchanneled, turns into empathic distress. It signals to the body, the brain, our physiology that we are literally hurting. But if we teach people to go to compassion, it lights up those same systems in the brain, same regions in the brain that are tied to all of the good stuff. So, the real key here that you need to understand is that empathy does drain and compassion energizes. So that's why staying in empathy really does lead to collapse. But moving into compassion will actually sustain us. And the neuroscience actually confirms what clinical practice shows. Empathy is not enough. It's just not enough. Now, here's where it gets a little sticky. There's something called mirror neurons, and these were found in an Italian research lab, I think in the 90s. And I've talked about this on other podcasts. So, mirror neurons are these specialized little brain cells, and they fire both when we act and we observe somebody else's acting. So, they kind of underlie this imitation and learning, and yes, emotional resonance. So, for example, and I talk about actually mirror neurons in my Untangling workbook series because it's so key in the therapy room. So, for example, when a client cries, my mirror neurons will resonate with them. So I'll feel my pain, their pain in my body. That's what empathy is because that mirror neuron is firing. But this is why it is so important for the skill. If we remain in that resonance, like I'm resonating with this client's pain the whole time, then that means both me and the client stay in that pain and in that distress. So I have to regulate myself. So I'm slowing my breathing. Maybe I'm doing some grounding. I'm steadying my voice. I'm watching eye contact. What I'm doing is I'm offering the client a new state to mirror or new mirror neurons. So it's very important for me in session with clients, especially with trauma anxiety. These are highly elevated sessions. But if I don't regulate, if I am not aware of what's taking place with the mirror neurons, we're both off to the races and I'm going to do nothing to help them. Nothing. So it's so important that we learn co-regulation. Empathy is a doorway, but regulation is the thing that transforms it, okay? So we move from simply feeling something into modeling resilience. So again, if all we do is feel, no one would feel better, let alone have the wherewithal to learn any of my tools, right? So what's the point of therapy? This is where I hear these stories all the time from clients coming in saying, I've tried 7 other therapists and all I do is I sit there and I cry and I leave and I feel worse. That's not co-regulation. We're not, as a clinician, it is absolutely incumbent on us to help them regulate. But if we just sit there and we're just like a blank canvas, which we've heard that a lot in the counseling field, which I think is a blank slate, I think it's ridiculous. You can't be blank when you're dealing with people's pain, but you also can't bring in the pain and sit in it, if that makes sense. So, co regulation is so important. This is important in marriages. This is important in business relationships. This is important with our kiddos. If you're dysregulated, your kid is going to be more dysregulated. If you're still, dysregulated after an argument with your partner, you're going to increase the severity of the fight. This is why mirror neurons are a beautiful, wonderful thing, but we can't sit in it. We cannot sit in it. It's why the empathy has to move towards compassion. So, for example, I had a healthcare worker. She came to me last year and she kept saying to me that she was just utterly depleted. And it was really causing issues within her marriage. She was having a hard time really engaging with her young son. I believe she had a son. And she was just really having a hard time. And basically, she was like, I'm taking on all my clients' pain. And so I go home and I cry. I can't sleep. I can't stop thinking about each case. So she was really in the suffering. And here's the thing, she saw this as proof of her compassion, but what we discussed was what was actually happening was that empathic distress. Her brain just was on this constant loop of pain resonance, right? Her system, her nervous system was stuck in this threat mode because she's just kept pinging the snot out of that sympathetic system, the fight or flight system, because she told herself that if I don't feel the patient's pain, therefore I am not a compassionate human being. So when we work together, I really had to help her practice that mirror to strength sequence, right? So that's really first she had to acknowledge that that she resonated with her patient's pain. That's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with it. But then she needed to learn to regulate her own nervous system. So we came up with our toolbox for her to regulate her system. We regulated the system, then we went into more of the cognitive and reframed what her perspective was. And then from there, she was able to model more calm strength outwardly. So it took time. This doesn't happen over, one session. I mean, if you're constantly practicing this empathic distress, and that's really what you're practicing, if you're choosing to only feel people's pain, it is very difficult to shift out of it. Because again, this is a physiological response. This isn't just, a psychological response. So it does take time to practice new tools and to really devise an understanding of what's taking place in the mind and the body. Oftentimes, it's called a bottom up approach, is saying, okay, we have to regulate the nervous system, but then where does my body tell me that I'm getting into this fight or flight state? Is it shallow breathing? Is it a sick stomach? Is it tight shoulders? Is it tight throat? So we understand what's happening in the body because the body whispers far before our brain is off to the races. And so we really create this kind of timeline of how we understand that we go from empathy to absolute full on distress. So as she and I worked through it, it was really profound. I mean, it really was. She was able to reframe that she did care deeply, but she didn't have to collapse under the weight of empathy. She could operate in compassion, right? Which energized her, and she was much more effective not just at work, but at home too. And it's super sustainable. So I want to take just a brief little kind of pause and ask you to kind of ask yourself a couple of questions just to think about this as we're going through this empathy series. Number one, where in your life do you take on someone else's pain as though it were your own? This is very, very common. I see this a lot with people that are transitioning in life, maybe out of working full time into retirement. Maybe it's saying goodbye to kids in the home. I see this a lot where there's this kind of clinging on to somebody else's pain. So really think about that. Identify where in your life you're taking someone else's pain on as if it were your own. It is very hard for us to distinguish this when it comes to our loved ones, those that are closest in our life. But you really do have to honestly assess, am I taking on, say, my son's poor choices as my own, like seeing his distress and his pain, right? You really need to be honest with yourself. Then I want you to ask, how does your body feel when you do this? So are you feeling tense, restless, exhausted? Are you crying just as much along with them? Really identify, am I mirroring their reactions? Now, keep in mind, if you recognize, ooh, shoot, I'm mirroring their reactions with those little mirror neurons, what are you doing? You're actually increasing distress. You're dysregulating the other person even more. So, what would it look like to mirror strength instead of distress? So, this isn't for people have a hard time with this when we start learning this. This is not about denying the distress that the person is in. That is not it at all. But it is not sitting in the distress with them. So, for example, I talk a lot with individuals that have lost loved ones, and they say to me all the time, people can't even just like sit with me. So people have a very hard time. Either they don't want to feel any of your pain or they're like too amped up by your pain. Does that make sense? But if we can mirror strength, so sometimes mirroring strength is, again, just like I regulate myself in session when it's a really tough session that I'm listening to. Maybe it's my breathing patterns, or I'm doing my own grounding exercises. I have a large chair in here that I sit in and they're stitching. And so a lot of times when I can feel dysregulation, when I'm like, ooh, I'm stepping into this client's story too much, I don't want to become dysregulated. And I recognize this by my heart rate increasing. I always notice it when my heart rate increases. What I do is I ground by rubbing the stitching on my chair. And I know that sounds silly, but it grounds me to the here and now. Like, hey, Piper, this is not your story. You're sitting in this space with this human that really needs your strength. So we can mirror strength instead of distress. So, where in your life do you take someone else's pain as though it were your own? How does your body feel when you do this? And what would it look like to mirror strength instead of distress? So these questions really do matter because, again, they help us shift from empathy, from this like passive flood of emotion into an active choice. And that's really important. So, one thing that I have a bone to pick about, shocking, I know, is something called compassion fatigue. And I really think this is a misnomer. So, you hear compassion fatigue all the time. You hear it in the counseling field, medical fields, and even ministry. And so, the truth is, I think it's a misnomer. Compassion does not fatigue, right? Compassion motivates us to action. Compassion energizes. Compassion lights up those brain reward centers and motivation centers. What I actually think they're experiencing is empathic distress fatigue. It's not compassion fatigue. Compassion is totally different from empathy. So they're not fatigued from caring too much. That's kind of what you think about with compassion fatigue. They're actually fatigued from being stuck in that resonance with the pain without moving through from empathy to sympathy to compassion. That's what I think is the actual problem. And so when I hear about compassion fatigue, I I take a little umbrage with it because it's not defined enough. And words matter. They just matter. So I think compassion, and here's the thing too, people say, well, but I am compassionate and it leads me to do so much. Well, then what we have to talk about is, especially we see this in a lot of like ministry where they're doing so much for the community, which is beautiful and wonderful, but then they're totally burned out. Okay, well then that's in a totally different realm. That's where we need to communicate boundaries. We need to communicate effective leadership, whatever it is within the ministry that you're burning people out because you're asking them to do too much. Is that compassion fatigue, or are you just using people? Does that make sense? They're totally different. And so I really do think this matters because when we mislabel it, we misdiagnose it. Does that make sense? Like when you mislabel compassion fatigue, when actually what I think it is empathic distress fatigue, then what we do is we tell professionals that their problem is caring too much, when in reality, the problem is they're channeling it too little. That's the problem. So I do take a little, I get annoyed with the compassion fatigue thing. They talk about it a lot in counseling school during my master's. And it always bothered me then because I'm like, well, compassion's not the bad thing. Compassion is what led me to come to school. The problem is you're just sitting there and just resonating with pain. That does nothing. So I think too, I've touched on this just a little bit. We'll talk about this more and more as the series goes on, is there's like this badge of honor. So in my field, this mislabeling has become a badge of honor. So you'll hear clinicians say like, "Oh, I'm so burned out because I care so much." Or you'll hear medical professionals, like I shared with that one client, who wear exhaustion as this proof of their dedication. So this is the issue. We are purposefully dysregulating our system. We're purposefully, I'm calling it what it is. This, you chose to sit in empathy. So this is a dysfunction that's paraded as a virtue. So instead of modeling resilience, we model collapse. So we reinforce this myth that the best therapists are the most depleted ones, and the best doctors are the most exhausted, and the best nurses are the most drained. This is wrong. And again, this is a bigger conversation than just empathy, empathic distress fatigue. This is talking about leadership. This is talking about so much more. But again, we have to be aware that there is a dysfunction in this mislabeling of it, and it really gets paraded around like this virtue, and it's not. You're burning out your brain, you're burning out your body. This is not strength. This is empathy unchanneled, and it's broadcasted as like an odd identity or characteristic, and it's not sustainable. It's super harmful both to the professional and those that they serve. It's really unsustainable and harmful. So years ago, when I was in, I think it was my first internship, you can see some real severe reactions with individuals that have believed the hype about empathy. And all they should do is feel, and all they should do is resonate with the pain in the office. So during my internship, we had to do group supervision. And so there were some of us in there with like different levels. So some of us were still students, some of us were APCs, waiting for full licensure. It just kind of was different. But we'd sit in group supervision. And I was working alongside this woman. I don't know if she got her APC or LPC. She must have been APC because she was in supervision. But anyway, we're sitting in there, and I think it was 3 or 4 of us were sitting in there, and she starts talking about that she became so flooded with her client's story that she disassociated, like full on bleeped out. She's not in the room at all. And that her system literally shut down, just like shut down. Now, listen, disassociation is this amazing thing that our brain does. But y'all, your therapist shouldn't be disassociating on you. They shouldn't be a therapist if they can't stay grounded, period. Now, there's some upsetting things that happen in session. I don't disassociate. I get to the dysregulation, I'm like, whoop, got to pull back, or I'll say to them,
Thanks for
I need
spending
to
this
take a
time with
minute.
me today on
Can we take a
Untangled Mind
bathroom break?
podcast.
I
My
just
hope
need
is
to take
that
a
what you
minute. This
heard
is,
today helps you
I'm
think
really feeling
differently,
this with
question
you. There's
deeply, and
nothing
take
wrong with
real
pausing a
steps
session and
toward
saying
change.
that. And
So remember,
acknowledging,
empathy
whoo,
isn't the
I can
end, it's the
feel the
entry
depth of your
point. And in the
pain
real work is
today,
really moving
right now,
beyond
in this
feeling and
moment. So
into
let's take a
action.
moment and
If you're
let's
finding this series
regulate
helpful,
together.
I'd love for you to
But
share it
this
with someone
chick
who could benefit. And be sure to
disassociated
join me
in the
next
middle
time
of
as
her
we continue
session.
to untangle
What
the
was
myths around
wild to
empathy
me
and explore
is
the
that,
way
number
forward.
one, this is extreme. This is at the extreme end of empathic distress fatigue. Um, that her nervous system couldn't even hold that level of resonance, that it checked out. Yet it was framed in the middle of this group supervision as proof of how much she cared. And again, this goes into all the crap in the counseling profession and maybe other professions where there's this real lack of gatekeeping, that the director of this group wanted just to make more money and just totally ignored the fact that her clinician's disassociating, which is gross. So this is how far the myth has gone, that empathy is the only way to go. We've normalized trauma responses in professionals as an evidence of virtue, instead of naming them for what they are: sign of poor boundaries and unsustainable practice. And by the way, go to therapy, get your stuff figured out before you think you can be a therapist, for real, because you're causing harm to that client. This is, I mean, we hear funny stories, and they're not really funny, where or clinicians fall asleep in session or whatever. But can you imagine, as a client that comes in, say you have a horrible trauma, maybe you're a rape victim, and you're reiterating, you're saying out part of your memory with this, whatever. And your therapist also has a rape history and is not able to manage your story, that they just blink out and disassociate on you. And disassociation looks different for everyone. Sometimes you get like this hazed over look. I've seen people, they can rock every once in a while with me. Sometimes they'll just say, uh-huh. And they're not blinking. Disassociation looks different on everyone. But can you imagine your therapist doing that to you in the middle of you working through your own trauma? That's insane. That's insane. So again, this is where this idea that empathy is the only way to go, this myth is really normalizing traumatic responses in professionals as like they're so virtuous. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Now, sometimes the cost of empathy only shows up in the individual nervous system, like I shared, right? But what about if their system is so overwhelmed by this empathic distress that it literally shuts down? And then all of a sudden it's collective. What if people surround themselves with communities where everyone is living in their feels, where empathy becomes contagious? So remember, mirror neurons are firing not just between two people, but across groups. So this emotional resonance spreads. Stress and distress echo. So a lot of times we can see this in grief groups, divorce groups, where you can go into a divorce group and it's like a processing group, and pretty soon everybody's so angry and they walk away and they're so mad. Or you can see this in grief groups where you go to get over the loss of a loved one and all you feel is the depth of everybody's grief. So psychologically, right, this can morph into what we call like collective hysteria, or like a mass psychogenic illness. Okay. So where groups of people, they start to share these same heightened states of emotionality and even physical symptoms without any external cause. Those mirror neurons are incredible, but they can be dangerous. So neuroscience shows us why empathic resonance activates the insula in the anterior cingulate cortex, right? Our pain and threat circuits, and then it mirrors across a group, and these regions keep firing. So it's reinforced by like this social validation. You're not even aware of it. So then you add in the amygdala's threat response, and HPA axis is just like pumping cortisol and adrenaline. All of a sudden, you've got individuals turning into a whole group. So the physiology of the whole group becomes dysregulated. So the result of this group is either hyperarousal, it's exaggerated perception of threat, it's impaired cognitive control. So that means the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that's responsible for critical thinking, it goes offline. So in its place, the limbic system just completely dominates. So the group becomes less rational, more reactive, and increasingly paralyzed in shared distress. That is why communities that glorify empathy without channeling it often spiral into cycles of despair or outrage or performative suffering. The brain isn't just sharing feelings, it's amplifying them. So once the group's nervous system synchronizes in distress, it becomes like nearly impossible to pull out of it. That's again why we need co-regulation. We need intentional leadership and reframing. It is so key. Empathy is wonderful, but we cannot stop there. So, whether we call it compassion fatigue, which, I think that's a misnomer, burnout or collapse, the root issue is the same. Empathy without channeling is not good because it misfires everything in our nervous system and our brain. So for clinicians, like I've said, this leads to exhaustion and attrition. For parents, it leads to enmeshment. For leaders, it's paralysis maybe. And for individuals, it can lead to anxiety and an identity built around suffering. So in each case, empathy, looks like this proof of virtue rather than a pathway to change. And that's what I want to say. Empathy can be a pathway to change, but we have to learn to channel it. And again, If all you do is sit in empathy because you're telling yourself it's proof of the beautiful part of who you are, then your nervous system pays the price. Your brain pays the price. So, what do we do with this? First, we have to acknowledge that empathy is absolutely necessary. I am not demonizing empathy at all, but it's not sufficient. It's the doorway. Second, when I talked about the ladder, we got to climb the ladder. So, from empathy to sympathy, from sympathy to compassion. Empathy resonates, sympathy recognizes, compassion acts. And third, we got to co-regulate. We have got to learn to regulate. We have to learn to model strength. And that is where therapy changes people. It's not by drowning them with their own emotions because I'm feeling them so much, but it's by offering them a stronger state to join, right? That's what therapy is. And fourth, we've got to stop glorifying distress. Y'all, I'm tired. I've been going through some kind of scary, not even kind of, some scary health stuff that we're trying to get to the bottom of. And I am telling you, I'm not talking about it. I'm not glorifying it. I'm letting my clients know because I feel bad. I've been moving sessions around because of all these stupid doctor appointments. But I am not glorifying the distress. I'm not glorifying that I'm scared to death. I'm not glorifying any of the things that I'm going through because all that does is heighten the nervous system that I need to calm. So we've got to stop calling collapse proof of virtue. We got to do that. We got to stop doing that in these professions. The helping professions, I get it. We are all exhausted and we've got our own crap that we're dealing with. But you got to stop holding on to it as if it's proof of who you are, like that you're a good person. We have to start teaching our industries and ourselves, right? That resilience and not exhaustion is the evidence of care. We have to change that. So, empathy is powerful, but what we've learned today is if it's left unchanneled, it really does hurt the brain and the body. And listen, the soul, it does. Compassion, by contrast, sustains and energizes. We can see it on brain imaging. This is not just Piper spouting out just some of her opinions. No, this is proven. So, again, as you kind of reflect on what we've talked about today, ask yourself, am I living in empathic distress? Is it actually empathic distress fatigue, not compassion fatigue? Stop calling it that. Or am I trying to learn to regulate and move into compassion? Are you doing that? So, in our next episode, we're going to take on empathy as a cognitive trap and how empathy functions as a heuristic. So, these are those shortcuts in our brain that, again, feel virtuous, but they actually reinforce oftentimes avoidance and false beliefs. So, be sure to check out the third podcast coming out in our empathy series. Thanks so much for joining me. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks so much for joining me, Piper Harris with the Untangled Mind podcast. I hope you learned some tools that can equip you to untangle your mind and untangle your life. If you're curious about working with me for your anxiety or trauma, head on over to my website at untangledmind.net to connect with me. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review me on your podcast listening platform and share it with your friends and family. As always, thanks so much for listening to me, Piper Harris with the Untangled Mind podcast. I'll talk with you next time.